Good afternoon and a very, very warm welcome to this book discussion at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. We have the pleasure of having with us today the author of this very, very thought provoking and timely book titled Blinkers Off: How Will the World Counter China? Ms. Gaurie Dwivedi, who is a seasoned journalist, columnist, author, and of course, many other things. She has over 16 years of experience of journalism and is also an economist by training. And she is associated with various think tanks in India, the United Services Institution of India and India Foundation. So I welcome Gauri uh, for accepting our invitation to have a book discussion here and to be present. We also have the pleasure of having with us today Professor Ambassador P. Stobdan, who was earlier a senior fellow at Institute of Defense Studies and Analyses and is currently a senior fellow at Delhi Policy Group, New Delhi. And he is currently also on the Advisory Council of Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs. And of course, he is doing many other things. He is an eminent expert on Ladakh and, of course, a proud, eminent citizen also from Ladakh. He is well known for his micro level knowledge of the region and, of course, of China as well. So, once again, I welcome Ambassador Stobdan. Then we have the pleasure of having with us Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, uh, Professor in Center for East Asian Studies at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Kondapalli has had a long association with us and has participated in many of our discussions, lectures, etc. So I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Kondapalli. Then we have the pleasure of having with us Dr. Sanjay Pulipaka, who has been a senior fellow here at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. We know him well, and he again is an expert on East Asia and China and is the author of important books on the subject. So I welcome Dr. Sanjay Pulipaka as well. Now, before we start the discussion, uh, I must confess that I have not read the book. Uh, this is a confession that must be made because uh, the fact is that the book was given to me long ago, probably 2 months ago, and therefore I have no excuse whatsoever. Many people get away by saying that I received the book only a few days ago, so I couldn't find the time. So my apologies, but I have benefited with my from my discussion with the author, and I have attended the book launch, which took place earlier at another location. So I have some idea of it. Of course, I will talk about it later. So with these very brief welcome remarks, may I now invite Gauri to give her author's remarks in 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you for that confession as well as that very kind introduction, Ravikantji. And thank you to Nehru Memorial for hosting this discussion. It's a timely discussion and a very important, I believe, to have this right now. The book is provocatively titled, I would say, very plain speak is what the literature really attempts to do, which is to take our blinkers off when we talk about China and how should we counter it. But in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to first try and decode why is it that we need to counter China? What is it that China's threat is to the world that we need to counter? And who is really going to counter it? Is it going to be India? Is it going to be America? Is it going to be Japan? Is it going to be Quad? How is it that the entire Chinese threat would be tackled? So that's essentially the broad outline in which I'll keep my remarks. Firstly, China did not grow overnight. It took 30 long years to grow. And during that period, the world slept. And which is why the first chapter or the first segment of the book says, while you were sleeping. It captured parts of America, Europe, Asia, um, Latin America, and in fact, all the way till North Pole and South Pole. And during that journey, there were many exceptions that were made, many exemptions that were given, all in the hope that one day China would fall in line or become like us, whichever way we want to put it, which is become a liberal democracy where rule of law, order would be respected, and there would be, um, as democratic regimes around the world operate, that is what the hope was as far as China is concerned. That didn't happen, and all along, China kept growing. So the book talks about specific exemptions, specific instances when those exemptions were made, all along in the hope that China would try and become, as I said, like us. But during that, first of all, it joined the WTO. 20 years have passed by. During that time, the subsidy mechanism and the huge exemptions that the Chinese state owned enterprises continue to enjoy have not been wound down, despite 6 American presidents extracting a promise from Chinese presidents. So that promise is what the world continued to hold on to. All along, of course, China shredded to pieces. You may say international norms, you may say promises, you may say treaties as well, because WTO is an international agreement that countries abide by. The first half of the book talks about exactly how much of the world does China really own? How much of the world is really under China's direct and indirect influence? For instance, in Europe, during the decade 2010 to 2019, this is a very recent time period that I'm highlighting, Chinese companies gained ownership of at least 4 airports, including the Frankfurt Hahn Airport in Germany, 6 ports, a dozen professional soccer clubs. And by the time the screening of Chinese investments actually began in Europe, Beijing's clout and influence was so enormous that it could even dictate what specific human right violations it could actually condone. That is how widespread China's influence in Europe is. Again, these are very small instances, but that's what the book really talks about. It goes on to highlight in Latin America, which is America's backyard. Frankly, US should be able to control what happens in its backyard. It is still this world superpower. That isn't the case anymore. It contributes to the largest FDI in 33 countries in the Latin American region, and now runs one of the largest investment mechanisms in that part of the world. Likewise, you come to Asia, it's a similar story. And during that entire journey where China rose, it also continued to formulate its own parallel formation of countries. Because the idea that China built this entire network was to try and hold not just the world accountable to its own parallel set of definitions of human rights or any of the other mechanisms that it followed its order for, but it wanted to create a parallel formation of countries. And frankly, the book at some level, I can take some, with humility, I say it is almost prophetic where it says that there is a formation of countries that is now taking place from China, which is Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Russia, and of course also includes Afghanistan and parts of it in Turkey as well. So essentially the book talks about first aspect, which is how much does the world now come under China's influence? And second, it talks about why was it influence so important for China? What is it that it wanted to do? It was not like any other superpower that wanted to invest and create new markets. It wanted to now have a parallel formation of countries where it could create its own parallel network of a world order. Was it to create a parallel world order, or was it to actually compromise the existing world order? That's the question that this book raises. And it talks about that. And again, the chapter talks about whether it is Asia, whether it is Middle East, or whether it is in Europe or Latin America, the attempt is to create a parallel network of countries. It also talks about just how significant could be the Russia-China partnership that we are now seeing unfold in the entire Middle East. But just how deep could that relationship be, and just how profound could be the impact of that, is what the book talks about. It says Xi and Putin, power of compounding. And it goes on to talk about that the Russia China partnership will not just be about military, it will not just be about security or strategic, it will encompass all dimensions of engagement. It will also include engagement in outer space, it will talk about engagement in the polar or the Arctic Circle region, and of course, economic engagements. So that's essentially what the book attempts to highlight, which is that China rose. It rose at the expense of the world, and when it was rising, what is it that it really wanted to do? Which was to create an alternate formation of countries and then go on to challenge the world as we knew it. And that is the reason why there has to be a concerted attempt to try and tackle the challenge. And why is it that a concerted attempt needs to be made? Simply because there is no single country that is large enough to handle China on its own. The book clearly says that America is not as big as it was during the Cold War and cannot deal with China on its own. It says for the first time since World War II, America may not be able to take on a rival by itself due to its fast reducing gap with China. It needs other players, and it could be UK, France, Germany, which could be more issue based partnerships, but it will be important for India, Japan, Australia, and some of the other Indo Pacific countries to come together and create deterrents for China to not exploit the fault lines that exist in the world. And these fault lines are not in the domain of military. At some level, the literature right now that surrounds China either talks about Indochina or it talks about China through the prism of the military threat it poses. Unfortunately, the threat that it poses in non military dimensions is equally, if not more, amplified, either in the space of trade or in the space of technology, which is where you see the cyber threats, or in the space of outer space, biological warfare. All those are aspects where China is seeking to weaponize the leverage that it uses. And how will that leverage be used and exploited? It will be through the trading mechanisms it has deepened. China is the world's second largest or largest trading country. Not the world's, for 120 countries, it is either the largest or the second largest trading country or the partner, which essentially tells that in every second country in the world, it can dictate terms simply on the basis of its economic muscle. It's not out of the ordinary that it decided that it will ban Australian exports. It has done so a dozen times in the last 6 years alone. With South Korea, it has done it with Mongolia, with other countries as well, and all the while, it kept on increasing the leverage it had. And this book is now talking about how is it that leverage can be handled, how is it that deterrence can be built and created in all these dimensions. As far as technology is concerned, it says the book highlights that it's going to be techno political challenges that the world is now going to see, where you will have geopolitical aspirations being fulfilled through the dimension of technology, whether it is cyber wars or whether it is creating space stations in outer space. All that will have a very large impact, either in terms of artificial intelligence, surveillance technology, quantum mechanics. All that are aspects where China is looking to again weaponize. None of these dimensions or aspects of engagement have any regard for borders or physical borders, which means countries need to come together. And they need to come together in all these dimensions to create a deterrence. And that's what the book presents. And how is it that all these aspects of deterrence can be created? It says, in terms of trade specifically, to say that China's economic muscle can be countered simply by signing more free trade agreements is not being able to accept just how significant its economic leverage is. For that, more regional partnerships need to be built at. More regional groupings will have to be created that can circumvent the Chinese economic power and economic coercion tactics again. And then it also talks about how is it that some of the other multilateral platforms need to be strengthened. It is deeply ironical and unfortunate that one of the most significant violators of WTO is China. It is a developing country. It actually gets the same amount of exemptions that a Venezuela does, that a Libya does, that an Egypt does, that Cambodia does. And it continues to violate WTO mechanisms for the last 20 years. And the Deputy Director General of WTO is a Chinese national who continues to say that China will not abide by WTO mechanisms. These fault lines can only be dealt with collectively. They cannot be dealt with individually. And to deal with all of these specific instances, which are part of a larger problem, require America to actively engage with some of the other countries, which is India, Japan, as I mentioned, Australia, France, which has a very significant presence in the Indo Pacific, and then talk about all these other aspects, maybe in greater detail, when some of the other panelists talk about their opening remarks. So that's essentially what the book talks about, which is you need to counter China because of the sheer threat that it presents. I'm going to end with just one paragraph that the book highlights in the end, which is that if Xi Jinping had whipped up domestic sentiment on an ancient and vague concept of Tianxia, translated as all under the heaven, this meant the world was divinely bestowed upon the emperor, who, as the son of heaven, had heaven's decree. The epicenter of the world was the Chinese emperor, and countries were either tributaries or vassal states. Pakistan is following that pattern. It is a vassal state for all practical purposes. The CPC, the Chinese Communist Party of China, is trying to create the exact same imagery with the BRI expected to create vassal states across the world, and Xi Jinping as the legitimate sovereign in the world. The world map would be just one of the casualties for such a vision to be fulfilled. To avert this, the world must take off its blinkers. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you very much, Gaurie, for that very brief yet comprehensive comments on the book. I, of course, have many questions about it, but I'll come to it later. May I now request Dr. Sanjay Pulipaka to give his comments on the book? You are muted. Sanjay ji, you are muted.
Thank you.
So you have about 10 minutes. Each panelist
Okay.
has about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Let me at the outset thank Nehru Memorial Museum and Library for this invitation. Specific thanks to Deputy Director Dr. Ravi Mishra ji for this invitation. Also to good friend Iqbal and all of the friends at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. My congratulations to the author for writing a fine book titled The Blinkers Off, How the World Will Counter China. There is no question mark here, which means that the world will slowly over time counter China in a more coordinated manner. Of course, my congratulations to Pentagon Press for bringing out the book, one more edition to their large library of books on security and political issues, specifically with reference to China. As the author pointed out earlier, and in the book as well, the author argues for removing blinkers to understand the rise of China and regional and its impact on regional and global security. But what does it mean to remove blinkers? One of the things that really comes off well in the book is reference to the misplaced notion that we are seeing the revival of Cold War. In earlier times, it was Soviet Union, now it is China. That kind of an understanding is inaccurate. And the book points out as to why that is the case. One, China today is much more stronger than Soviet Union was. Two, China is much more economically integrated with various countries, major economies across the world. So therefore, it is not what we are not seeing that iron curtain kind of relationship defining the international structure today. The other important dimension is that the international politics is becoming increasingly multipolar. So therefore, it becomes imperative that the major countries and major powers should look for collective solutions that comes through. The author, as she pointed out, makes a very interesting and assertive point that United States on its own can no longer deal with the rise of China, and so therefore it becomes imperative for multilateral cooperation and multilateral frameworks to be designed, strengthened wherever they exist to contain the or to respond to the rise of China. So, what are the other blinkers that the author talks about? The other blinkers that the author talks about is that the world did not adequately understand the interrelationship between the rise of China, the economic rise of China, and the security threats. They somehow saw this in a dichotomy in terms of two separate watertight environments, and so therefore they did not adequately anticipate the consequences that we are witnessing today. The other very interesting point that is also made is that quite often when we talk of Indo-Pacific concept, people talk about Japanese and Indian concepts of Indo-Pacific having a convergence in the sense that their geographic space extends from East Africa to United States. On the other hand, other countries Indo-Pacific is also different. This book argues that this differentiation had an impact in the neglect of certain important areas such as East Africa and the Indian Ocean region. While talking about China, the book makes an important observation that the Chinese belligerents that you see in the territorial assertions today have a longer history, and it is seeing the current geopolitical context as a window of opportunity to make quick gains and assert its control on various contentious territories. The book, of course, maps in great detail all the territorial disputes that China was involved in. One of the things that comes across really well in one of the chapters is, especially pertaining to Southeast Asia and East Asia, is the Chinese clear tactics of trying to displace United States as a primary security provider, emerge as an important security anchor in the region, and compel others to accept the Chinese interests on its own terms. That mapping of this dynamic was done very well in the chapters pertaining to when they deal with East Asia and the Southeast Asian dimensions of the book. As the author pointed out earlier, and it also in the book it comes through, the author is deeply disappointed with the US approach towards China. And in fact, at one place she calls it as the Frankenstein called China, created by the United States. I mean, it's understandable given that the author points out that from President Nixon, there were about 6 or 7 presidents who did not economically contest Chinese economic tactics. So therefore, they assumed that somehow China will play by the rules of the game, which it is not happening now. There is also another dimension, I think, that is that the US, in my opinion, was fixated with other security issues, such as in Middle East and other places, and did not pay adequate attention. Of course, Obama talked about pivot to Asia, but that did not materialize. This gave space for China to scale up its defense acquisitions and also develop economic networks across the world, specifically in Southeast Asia and the other regions of the world. On Belt and Road, the author makes a very interesting point, that is that while China approximately invested 150 billion between 2010 2018 on infrastructure, Japan also spent quite considerable amounts of finances on developing infrastructures in different parts of the world. But the kind of publicity that China was able to generate for Belt and Road Initiative, Japan was not able to do for similar or more investments in infrastructure across different parts of the world. So this brings into perspective the importance of, in my opinion, the uh, 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 how you present an image of the soft power, managing media, international media, and other dimensions. Of course, in the recent past, we are seeing growing pushback of Chinese Belt and Road Initiative across different continents. There are concerns about debt trap diplomacy, loss of sovereignty, taking over of ports. All these things are mentioned in great detail in the book. Today, we are seeing a lot of hesitation in Europe on how to respond to China. This book provides history as to how China systematically engaged with various European countries under 6+1 framework and other frameworks to ensure that Europe has a divided opinion on how to respond to China tomorrow. The chapters on Africa are very interesting for me because they provide in great detail the granular detail, how China slowly, systematically adopted various tactics to access mineral resources. The author points out that when China was still a $1.3 trillion economy, it started thinking about Africa and investing in Africa. Today we are around 2.6, around $3 trillion, 2.6, 2.7, around that phase. Are we today investing in Africa in a similar manner, or do we have a strategic plan towards Africa? But it points to the need that we need to rethink. Of course, we have in the recent past collaborated with other countries in scaling up our economic presence along the Eastern African coast, but it points to an important dynamic that is taking place along the African coast. The other important dimension that I really found interesting in the book is its engagement with the Middle East, Chinese engagement with the Middle East. It appears that author brings out a two-track approach that China has adopted. One, it is engaged with Iran, as the author earlier pointed out, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan axis that is being developed in the recent past along with the Russians. The dynamic is going on, but simultaneously, what we are witnessing, according to the author, is growing engagement of Saudi Arabia as well and Israel, the two security pillars of United States in the Middle Eastern region. But we have to wait and see how long can China engage with these divergent actors who have multiple interests and often contradictory interests with each other. But it is a very useful chapter in the sense because it provides in great detail the Chinese economic engagement with even with countries such as Israel. And that is something that we need to study in greater detail, in my opinion. Of course, the author has pointed out about how China is engaging with other countries such as Russia. Important relationship between China and Russia is playing out for us, and that is something that we need to take note of. It is not as if the Chinese are having easy walk through the global landscape. The advent of COVID crisis has fundamentally altered some of these developments. It is here that the author comes up with a series of recommendations, such as rebooting alliances, the need for India and United States to collaborate more, for US to mend ties with its allies. And I found the references to Taiwan very useful because in a way they were prophetic, because what is happening in Taiwan Straits, the author tries to convey it in her chapter that this is the probable gameplay that may happen in the near future. So in that sense, developing relationships with Taiwan is also suggested. Of course, there are a host of other global governance frameworks and informational warfare that are cited. Overall, to conclude, in my opinion, the book is very useful for scholars on China, and more importantly, this book is not about China. It is also about how other countries sought to respond to rise of China. So in that sense, the title and the subtitle are very varied for me. But more importantly, if you pause for a while and take a step backward and see, quite often in the study of international politics, constructivists and others talk about that quite often it is the image making that matters. I mean, various countries, various policymakers, various institutions construct image of others and they engage with those images. So that's broadly the constructivist approach to international politics. If that is indeed the case, and of course various social factors and geopolitical location, all these impact in the way we construct image of others. The author here points out to us that there are limitations to such construction of images that we do of others. Somehow this whole notion, this question, will China rise peacefully? When it is already creating a lot of trouble in the neighborhood, but this question was repeated. Will China rise peacefully? Peaceful rise of China, will it happen? These point to me a very benevolent sort of a soft image of China that was constructed in the minds of many people. As a consequence, in my opinion, we did not, or different countries did not adequately anticipate the consequences of rise of China. In that sense, if you locate in larger theoretical literature, this book can be located in those arguments as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. May I now invite Professor Srikanth Kondapalli for his comments on the book.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra. Let me thank the NMML and the author, Ms. Gaurie Dwivedi, and colleagues, friends. A very good afternoon to you all. Let me congratulate the author for writing a very easily readable. I could read this quickly in 2-3 days' time. It doesn't hold you back in terms of the flow. So it's very reader friendly. Let me congratulate on that count as well. So the book has about 18 sections, both in the domestic and external dimensions. So it covers many aspects like the South China Sea, Indo-Pacific, the economy, PLA, People's Liberation Army, United Nations, trade, COVID-19, Russia, Japan, Taiwan, Belt and Road Initiative, European Union, Africa, Pakistan, and West Asia. The author calls it as Middle East. Indians generally call this as West Asia. So those are things that are covered, both external and domestic dimensions. So very expansive kind of canvas. So that's a very, in terms of policy option, the rise of China has created problems for the rest of the world. And so what are the solutions? So the author suggests that a multipolar solidarity has to be created. While in the presentation she mentioned about multilateralism, she mentioned in the book about multipolar solidarity. Both multilateral, multipolar are different and for specific audience. But I take the point that the rest of the world needs to sit up and look at the rise of China. So some of the recurring themes in the book are China rise. China rise is creating ripples. China's influence is increasing substantially all across. So China's power is increasing, or what we generally mention in the security studies, the comprehensive national power is increasing in various dimensions. It includes economy, military. It includes the soft power. In this case, China's soft power had substantially declined with the COVID-19 or with the other aspects. So probably an element of that could have added some balance to the analysis. Comprehensive national power would also include the energy consumption, political stability in a country, the ability to influence the rest of the world, what the author mentions as increasing influence, could be factored in these fashion. Also, the environment, broader environment within which that state is located. So comprehensive national power is increasing. That's the overall argument. And so when we discuss power in political science, specifically in relation to a rising country, and when we look at their impact on the rest of the world, we have these three concepts or stages. A status quo is power, a revisionist power, and a revolutionary power. So the author mentions that China is a revolutionary, is a revisionist power, so which means it wants to tweak the international system, international rules, and various other. So basically, while it is satisfied with the overall system under the UN, under the other, as China keeps mentioning, the revisionist power would only tweak a little bit here, a little bit there, in order to enhance further its power in global terms. So revisionist power would be somewhere in between a status quoist and a revolutionary. China also was a revolutionary power during 50s and 60s. At one time, Chou En-lai, the premier, mentioned that they would like to walk away from every other international institution and set up a revolutionary United Nations, because China was barred from entering the UN between 1945 to 1971. So they mentioned about the revolutionary United Nations. Of course, they failed in that process because nobody recognized them. Very few countries recognized them in the 50s, prior to the Bandung Conference in 1955. So there were problems about the status quo's position, and the author suggests to the revisionist streak in the Chinese thinking. But the slate is still not clear about the revisionist, because in some aspects, China still sticks to the status quo's position. For example, 2 weeks ago, China reminded India of the 1172 resolution. As you know, in 1998, when India tested the nuclear weapons, the Chinese and the Americans were in the forefront pushing the 1172 resolution on roll, cap, and eliminate. Roll back, cap, eliminate nuclear weapons from South Asia. This was during the reports about Agni 5 launching. So, although 1172 has nothing to do with missile launches, yet the Chinese invoke this, basically trying to tell India and put India in its place by the 1172 resolution. Also, they have taken the Indians in the Security Council on Kashmir. So that is again a reminder of those. But most important here is the status quo streak rather than the revisionist streak. When you look at the Chinese position in IAEA and NSG in 2008, when the issue of clean waiver came up, that was the... So in other words, China has both the status quoist as well as revolutionary, depending on which works. Much like Deng Xiaoping said, red cat or white cat, as long as it catches the mice. So status quoist or revisionist should be the areas where some of that influence that China is exerting can be configured and looked at. From the point of view of China rise, Chinese have, so globally there are different opinions. Martin Jack suggests to positive influence of the China rise, and the Kissinger's engagement policy also has a positive element, because they are subsidizing, Chinese are subsidizing the American consumers with cheap products. Still over 70,000 American companies are functioning in China, $700 billion of investment. So as the author mentions, it is not quite possible for a Cold War to emerge, because you have also 6,000 people prior to COVID-19, 6,000 people going from US or China or vice versa to each other. So the classical Cold War cannot happen. And as we saw recently, Biden's phone call to Xi Jinping and the compromise on trade and Taiwan is reflected in that influence as such. Despite the Anchorage meeting, despite Wendy Sherman's treatment or others, this could be treated as the... but when the... so global opinion is kind of divided on between the so-called Panda Huggers and the blue team. Panda Huggers suggesting that we need to hug the panda because it is providing for subsidized products all across, and they may change, as the author mentioned. Years of engagement would change China to become more responsible. The former IMF president and former US Secretary of State, former Assistant Secretary of State, and others have similar view as the architect Kissinger at that time. So that is a view supported both in US, also in India, for instance. Nehru had the engagement policy with China, and he wanted the Chinese to be part of the mainstream. And so he invited them to the Bandung, he invited them to the Afro-Asian and others, and learned lessons in 62, of course. So many in India also have followed the engagement policy since the 1950 onwards. So you have the global opinion divided on whether to engage with China or to balance China or remain as a status quo even when China is rising, or even contain China as a policy option. So all these policy options are visible in how do the Chinese look at their own rise. They have these 3-4 theories. One is the hitchhike theory, that China is on the highway and it took the help of United States for that ride, and took the technology, took the investments, and so it avoided opposing US hegemony directly and benefited from the US or Western countries. Then you have also the dominant theory that the Chinese generally put across. Theory of China as a favorable opportunity. Everybody can do business in China. They can make money, come over, you can make money. And so even Indian companies have gone to China in order to make money. The Ajanta watches, for example, they were given good facilities in China. So likewise, many Indian companies have gone to Guangdong and other places to make money. So China is a favorable opportunity. Then you have also the China collapse theory by the Forbes magazine writer. So there is China collapse because of the problems in financial aspects of the banks, public sector banks, the state-owned banks. So it is going to collapse. That's his argument. There is the other theories, like every rising country had a contribution to the humanity. And so what is China's contribution to the world? Here, the Chinese are still blank in explaining what is their contribution. Soviet Union had the nuclear borrowed from the Germans, or space programs, or the military-industrial complex. The Americans had the automobile sector, again, from the steam engine from UK, or the Silicon Valley, a major contribution in terms of the ICT, which we are all using now, and very useful during the COVID-19 as well. So what is your contribution to the global community? China is still not able to explain, except for the 4 ancient contributions, the 4 compass, the other 3, printing, fire, and the others. So the Chinese were not able to explain on this aspect. But increasingly, 2 more theories are coming up in explaining China rise. One is the China threat theory, not by Chinese scholars, but scholars from outside. And to an extent, Ms. Dwivedi also is suggesting to that argument. In the background of the COVID-19, there is one more theory, that is China arrogance, partly the wolf warrior diplomacy and others, which somehow the author missed out in the book in explaining the arrogance theory of China. We were great before the Opium Wars. We had the century of humiliation during the Opium Wars and subsequently, and now we are rising. So the China arrogance theory is you need to accept Chinese rules and regulations and so on. We will not allow the WHO to investigate the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So basically, this arrogance also combines with exceptionalism in many areas, which the wolf warrior diplomats in China have suggested too. So the Chinese look at in all these dimensions. And so there is a difference between how outsiders, including Westerners and Indians, look at China and how the Chinese look at their own rise. So the Chinese concept here is the community of common destiny, which basically means many of these Chinese concepts are very innocent looking but heavily ideologically loaded. Basically, they would like to have alliances and friends in the future. In order to rise, this is very important. So the speech by Xi Jinping in 2015 on political partnership and others is the key in this understanding of community of common destiny. So their sites are clear, and 2035, 2049 projections have been made. And so I think it is important to put these in this context. Finally, I would say I was impressed with the bringing in ancient strategies. At every section of the different sections have these ancient adages, ancient strategies, and an explanation in that regard. So there is a thread that is going through in the different sections. Let me congratulate. But the causal connection between the ancient strategy and the current reality, that probably should have been further explored. So my suggestion there. A few comments here and there on Russia and Australia and Pakistan. In terms of Russia, the Lavrov's comments on October 2nd, saying that we will not accept the Indo-Pacific construct because that disrupted the Asia-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific construct helped the Russians and the Chinese in order to focus in this area. Russian pivot to Asia and the Chinese growth.
May I request you
Yes,
to...
I will wind up. So Russians would have a problem in aligning completely with China. There are several internal debates within Russia on that count. So it is not completely in partnership with China on that front. Australia, having said all about the WHA, World Health Assembly comments last May, and the tariffs imposed. With the energy crisis, the Chinese are quietly going back to Australia for the coal. So there is always the plan B in this, which the other probably would take into consideration. Pakistan, after the killing of 9 Chinese in Dasu hydroelectricity, the Pakistanis ISI said 3 bags full to China. But then there is no solution. There is no finding of who the culprits were. So Pakistan also has a plan B, like they had with the Americans. Let's squeeze the Americans, let's squeeze the Chinese. So Pakistan is very clever on that. They took away some $39 billion from the US. Probably they already had $29 billion in CPEC projects. And terrorism is an instrument for Pakistan to counter China in the future. So let me stop here. Some of these could have been explored in terms of other countries responding. But the author mentioned about multipolar solidarity and referred to the Quad and others as solutions for countering China rise or China's influence. So let me stop and thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Kondapalli, for your very insightful comments on the book. May I now request Ambassador P. Stobdan to share his views on the book with us.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra. Frankly, I haven't read the book. I got the soft copy yesterday. I was in Ladakh, so there was no way that I could have access to the book. But let me congratulate. I just went through the introduction and few other chapters. It's a very comprehensive book. It covers everything and it's up to date. Not only up to date, you are politically correct in this book. So therefore, one cannot dispute on that. You said whatever you need to say. Therefore, but being a student of international affairs, politics is a very dynamic phenomena. What is politically correct today may not be politically correct tomorrow. So As an analyst, I look at 360 dimension view. But it's very interesting. I agree with most of your points. You left nothing, in fact, to cover, because we are now working on a different template, especially in the post-COVID era. Everything has changed, and even the way the issue that we have raised, say vaccine diplomacy, initially with a global vision, whether we succeeded or not, but certainly that was the turning point in the global politics, the pandemic, and the way we're dealing with it. So the Chinese seem to have taken some advantage in enhancing its power structure, power system. And you raised certain conceptual issues. For example, China has subverted the rule-based order, the global governance system. The institution which was led by the West is now going to be taken over by the Chinese, whether it's a financial institution or the business institutions, which is, in a way, it's a reality and it's inevitable. It may not be China also, but it could be us. India is also rising. So I'm not opposed to rise of anything. Everybody should rise. I'm not cynical in that way. But obviously, everything must be discussed. For example, Taliban coming to power. It has come to power by use of force. It hasn't come to power with the democratic means. But the world seems to be now accepting that reality. I'm more aghast with that rather than with the Chinese rise. The Chinese rise, China has been there for some time, the rise of China. We've seen the way Chinese are rising. But the way even Americans had struck a deal with Taliban, and in this barbaric way which they displayed in the politically, and they come to power today in Kabul, fundamentally changed the global value system. I'm more worried about those rather than rise of economic power. For example, growth is a reversible issue. Growth can go up, growth can come down. So, but what to do with this, the other methodologies which been adopted by the system now? Partly because China has a global vision, which I envy. I'm not scared of China. I have a complex with China. China is not my enemy. We are not natural enemies of China. And I don't think Russia is a natural friend of China. Just as we are not natural enemy of China, the Russians are not the friends of China. So somewhere this is where the real politic which works in between, that we need to walk through. And for example, she touched in the book on the human right values. Now, the origin of human right is a Western concept. It's a colonial, post-colonial discourse. The origin of human rights has started in India, in South Asia. When the British Empire was leaving, they handed over railways, steel companies, railway companies, post offices. Everything which British owned was handed over to us, except the churches. There were thousands of churches which cannot be handed over to Indian state or Pakistani state. They existed like as it is, and the British argued, no, in the interest of human rights, you must respect the existence of churches and the ownership of these churches in the hands of few Anglo, Indians or whoever was running church system those days. This is how the human right concept started in the 40s and the 50s, and today now human right is a very global narrative. Opposed to that, I think the Chinese are not talking about human rights. Chinese are talking about human dignity, equality, justice, which stems from Taoism, Confucius, and Buddhism. Bahujan Sukhaya, Bahujan Hitaya. This is where the Buddhism talks about, which is ingrained into the Chinese mind. And opposed to what the Chinese and the Western thinking about human rights, we have another concept called human divinity. Indians saying that we are beyond human rights. Every human has a divinity, Atma. That's the ultimate value system which we measure. Every single human being has a divine disposition. So that is, that's how we conceptualize in our mind when we talk about human being, the value of human being. And the Chinese are calculating not just in terms of, I don't think divinity is in their mind. I don't think the colonial mindset is in them, but they're looking at Chinese the human rights issue in a different way. Now, is it rise of China or is it decline of others? Now, we have seen Afghanistan, how the Americans have left. And I saw in Central Asia in 2014 itself, the last plane, the American plane C-117 Global Master left some of the military bases in Central Asia. It was very painful. I saw the faces of the Americans, how they've been evicted or thrown out, rather. It's been going on for quite some time, for 20 years now, how the American must be displaced from Asia. And this will happen everywhere. I think not just Afghanistan or these places, but it could happen in East Asia. I agree with you. China cannot be wished away. It's a reality. It exists, and therefore one has very little choice. We will exist. Chinese will exist. But to have a clear plan to counter China, I'm afraid that is not going to happen. And we have seen that post whatever book that you have written, we have AUKUS. Where is the multipolar solidarity? Okay, unipolar world was not acceptable. Bipolar had vanished. Unipolar was not acceptable. So we talked about multipolar world. Where is the multipolar world today? So we've now landed up quadrilateral. Some are talking about trilateral. I don't know, maybe 2G theory, once again, it might come, bipolar system. So it's constantly changing. So if we are talking about quadrilateral system, quad system, somebody will form another quad. Third fellow will form another quad. So it's a multiple quadrilateral system. So the world politics is again changing, and therefore one cannot be so sure. The fact that we are not included in AUKUS tells you a lot. It's about blood. It's your commitment. It's your obligation to your blood. As a Ladakhi sitting right now having problem with China, I don't expect the Americans to shed their blood on me. I don't expect that. The Americans will shed blood only for their own people or people who they think that the part of their civilization. Not even French now or Germans. Only Australia and UK, could be Scotland one day, because that's where they belong to. They originated from the same blood. So it boils down to that level of politics. Well, idealistic thinking and the realistic thinking, this is where it dwells into. I'm not sure whether Belt and Road is being seen even by the American as a dangerous thing. I have read the origin of Belt and Road. It is nothing but the political geography of Buddhism. You superimpose the spread of Buddhism in Asia with the Belt and Road map. It's you put one map and put another map on that, you'll find the same replica. The Chinese are surprised how 2000 years ago the Indian philosophy spread on the trade route without use of force. Oh, Indians must be very genius. Now, in 21st century, they want to think something different. So they thought about Belt and Road. And my own understanding is that even the Americans, it's more about peace and stability. The Americans are very practical people. If they find Belt and Road is serving to curb terrorism, they say, go ahead. And we will be stuck with the thinking, oh, it's a Chinese origin, so therefore must be rejected. So the world is certainly quite thinking differently. What we have lost to China is the Asian centrality. You know Edwin Arnold, who said India is the light of Asia. Are we still seen as the light of Asia? Has China hijacked the light of Asia? This is where the question arises. The Indian centrality in Asia, if you do not have centrality in Asia, you cannot have centrality of the globe. So I think what we have lost to China is the focus of Asia. What we have in the West is the Anglophone world. Chinese are now creating an Asian phone world. I won't say Asian phone, but it could be Confucius, it could be Taoistic, it could be Buddhistic world, everything centered around those people which controls the ideology of Asia will control the world. Now, what is Asian ideology? Partly it's an Indian origin, but we have disowned. We don't have ownership about our own Indic thinking. We borrowed everything from America, England, or somewhere, and we are running a system which is not anything but Indian. It's just in the superficially we are Indian, but we've lost every Indian consciousness, which China has now taken over, or China has hijacked and using it for the rise of its power. So I'll just finish it. And so therefore, it's a international system is not just about interest driven. It's not just about value driven. It's something else that Chinese are looking at, and therefore I do not discount the fact that China is ultimate. I don't think so. I've read the history of the fall of China. You know, for example, the Battle of Talas during the Tang Dynasty in 751, China could not rise for 1,000 years after the defeat of China by the Arabs in Central Asia. They were ruling Afghanistan also for hundreds of years, the Chinese. Once they were defeated by the Arabs in 7th, 8th century, they could never come back to this. For the first time with the withdrawal of Americans, Chinese are now coming back to Iran or Afghanistan or wherever they are now coming back. We don't have to go to United States. The Chinese give you a lot of lessons about the Asian politics. The fact is that we are not conscious about history. We are conscious about mythology, but we are not conscious about history. If you are conscious about history, you will find a lot of. And finally, I think in international politics, most of our children today study in United States. And the day when our children, or maybe my grandchildren or your grandchildren, start going to Beijing and Shanghai for studies, then our interest will also change. It's not such a hard and fast kind of a system in which we are operating. It's a very dynamic, fluid system. It all depends on even in Taliban, for example, it's all about who gets the contract for the rice supply or drugs to Taliban. Once that interest is served, then our interest is served. Everything, narratives will change. Somebody will get the huge $30 billion contract in Afghanistan. The political discourse then follows. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Stobdan. We are now open to brief questions from the audience.
I would like to make a brief comments, if you please permit.
Please.
Okay. Firstly, I think, thank you very much for getting me to come here to this hall. We miss Shakti and the wonderful dialogue and discussions that we've had in this seminar room on a variety of subjects. And on this issue that you have raised in a very useful book is the challenge of our times. Not the present, the next 20, 30 years, questions that you have raised will be addressed seriously in a variety of dimensions, and we'll have to try and find answers, solutions to this. Very appropriately, you mentioned 30 years ago, the modernization took place. It's exactly 30 years ago that I first went to China. This was as an invitation of the PLA to the Indian Army, and I was one of two generals. Post 1988, Deng Xiaoping, Rajiv Gandhi handshake, it was decided that we will resume our relationships and also military-to-military relationships. And hence I went there. And all over the place, Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, Wuhan, etc., one of the things I wanted to find out during the trip was, are there any beggars in China? Heard of all the rapid developments which are beginning to happen in China. I searched all over the place, finally found one in Shanghai, an old person begging. But by then, China's modernization had taken off, and the results were seen, beginning to be seen. Now, that did not happen initially just in 1 year. There was a long history of that development, 1949 onwards, when Mao initiated, the modern China came into existence. Mao initiated measures that were revolutionary, fundamentally altered the basis of China. Of course, in that process, it cost the Chinese an enormous amount. Mao Zedong was personally responsible for the death of about 70 million Chinese, by far the largest in the history of the world.
Please be brief.
Now, yes. Now, as a consequence of that, let me just say that, of course, there's poverty elsewhere as well. The Chang'an Avenue in Beijing, where avalanche of cycles, no cars, nothing at all, etc., etc. Now, what has happened is China's development through its own effort, its own current policies, and it's a normal historical phenomenon, just as it happens all over history, all along in history. It is China's time now.
All right.
What we have entered today, and this is a challenge, is the period of the Thucydides trap, where an emerging power will challenge the existing hegemon in fundamental ways, through which there will be enormous turbulence, turmoil, changes, modifications, alliances, conflicts, and perhaps lead to a major global conflagration. And that is, of course, Chinese leadership. Politburo has study sessions.
Thank you. I think now.
Okay, then
you should
fine.
conclude.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other question? Ji, go ahead.
I've got, I think, 2 questions and a small observation. You have mentioned about there is huge subsidy that went unnoticed that had gone to state-owned enterprises. I remember when China entered WTO, there is, in fact, the world extracted quite a good amount of place by asking tariffs, industrial tariffs especially, to be reduced. I remember that. And if that is so, then how the state-owned enterprises they managed to escape giving subsidies? Second question: if suppose they managed, then why? I think you said that America didn't take notice or didn't try to take notice, but there are other countries in the world which they could have taken to dispute settlement mechanism. Why no other countries has taken Chinese to the dispute settlement mechanism? Then the third question is about, I remember Arvind Birmani has mentioned about China seeking rents from the world. I really didn't understand what he meant. Probably that would be helpful to you.
China seeking what?
Rent from the world.
Okay.
Because that is a very good measure of making money at the expenses of others.
We got it.
I've not understood that concept, but Arvind Virmani has mentioned it in one of his tweets.
Any other question, please? Yes, please go ahead.
We had very good comments from all three, and especially the last presentation raised a lot of questions and insights. Now, this human, I want to make some observations, quick observations. I think I agree with the speaker that it's not just China's rise, but the fall of the rest of the world, whether it is US or Europe or whatever, because of the much of the problems starting in Middle East. And then, do you think the democracies are working also? In many parts of the country, many parts of the world, these democracies are planted democracies. In even our country, democracy is there. Yeah, we can get rid of an unwanted party after 5 years. But what is politics doing? Are we happy with that? So it is a question of autocracy or whatever. That is a big problem there. But second, another point, I think the pandemic has been stressed by you as well as some of the speakers. But if I remember correctly, before that, when you used to see tourists, thousands of tourists in every country in China, from China, then this Trump government did away with some treaty. You may be better at telling this. So we were a little scared about our lives also, because the drugs, medicines, the basic things were manufactured there. And this Belt and Road, of course, is influential because of its geostrategic location rather than Japan, as somebody said. Then my one question is that, well, do all this China must be resorting to huge public expenditure? So I haven't read the whole book now. Have you gone into that we are restraining our fiscal deficits? Even US is getting into trouble about the public debt. So inflation and all that, is that creating any problem in that country?
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Couple of points and a question is mainly that why is China specifically getting emboldened now? They're striking out on all fronts at the same time. South China Sea, Ladakh, Leh Ladakh, Hong Kong, Taiwan especially. These are all fault areas which have been there for decades. But why at the same time is Xi Jinping moving out? Second, attached to that is there some kind of I mean, Xi Jinping is of course declared himself, literally emperor for life, more or less. But there was a sort of a release system where there would be, let's say, 2 terms maximum for the president and all. That is scrapped by this guy. Will there be some kind of a internal, because a lot of others are not going to get a chance to become the president, or the general secretary? Would there be some kind of a fallback from this? And the third part, just the last one, is what is going to happen, because 25 years ago, for those who remember, is Japan was the superpower rising, versus the United States. Demographics came in its way, aging population, which China is now facing at the same time. So how will
I think before Gaurie, the first question that you asked, I would like to try to answer it. When you say, why is it that China has antagonized everyone simultaneously, my brief answer as a student of history is because they have learned their history all wrong. They have internalized this Western concept of the world, which supposedly was Sinocentric once upon a time, or maybe it was Sinocentric for centuries or for millennia. All this, of course, is a modern Western construct. The world was never ever Sinocentric. In fact, as Ambassador Stobdan said, within Asia, probably India was always the center because of its very, very favorable geography. But the problem with China is that artificial narrative or construct created by the West from the 18th century onwards because of their Sinophilia, that has been adopted and internalized by China completely. And they have, like Martin Jacques says, when China rules the world. Well, there never was a time when China ruled the world. And I think, I'm going to talk about it. I don't think there will ever be a time when China rules the world. But the point is that China has internalized this narrative that we ruled the world and we were the center of the world. If China was the center of the world, just imagine Japan, which is just a few hundred kilometers from China, had its own emperor, never recognized China as the Middle Kingdom, never recognized the supremacy of Chinese civilization. So what kind of center of world was it if, another country, which was just a few hundred miles from it, never recognized its supremacy? India, of course, was regarded by China as the Western heaven. India had its own civilization. India never accepted any kind of superiority of Chinese culture or civilization or of polity. So what are we talking about? This Middle Kingdom discourse has been created by the West. It is only the small countries on the borders of China which accepted China as the Middle Kingdom or paid what is called tribute. Actually, it wasn't tribute, as we all know. But the point I'm trying to make is that China has internalized that false narrative that once upon a time we were the center of the world, we were the greatest nation in the world, we ruled the world, we were the largest economy, we were the largest military power, our emperor received a tribute from everyone. And obviously, it has all gone to China's head, as we can see very well. Now, they have abandoned Deng Xiaoping's sage advice. Don't take the lead and be cautious, because after 2008 I think they thought that their time under the sun had come and the West had finally declined, and America, of course, as Ambassador Stobdan says, many of the things that are happening, they give an indication that I don't agree with it that America is in terminal decline, but many people do think like that. So China obviously has accepted that also, and then coupled with the rise of Xi Jinping, I think the ground has been created for China to simultaneously antagonize all its neighbors and all the other great powers. And I think herein would be the biggest problem of China, because no country in the history of the world has ever succeeded in becoming a great power or a dominant power with this kind of a diplomacy. Leave aside its economic or military power. I think the lesson of history is very, very clear in this. Sorry for this interruption, but
No, but
now
Dr. Mishra, you're right. The intervention is absolutely correct. And you're right by pointing out that this Sino-centric world order creation, I think to a large extent, this mirage is being created back home and being pushed ahead, this propaganda by Xi Jinping and the Communist Party right now, due to several other internal factors that they are facing. To counter some of that, this narrative is being pushed ahead that, this was heaven's decree was there. We were the only one to whom the entire kingdom was bestowed upon, and everybody else was just our vassal states. Of course, BRI is creating some of them, but it's not going to lead to the world becoming subservient to the Chinese ambitions. And I think Dr. Mishra is right by pointing out that it's going to be the biggest mistake that China is going to make. And I'm also going to take, Arjun, the second aspect that you said about the demography aspects, that you're right that is China going to get old before it's going to get rich? I think that's the single biggest fear that many in China are facing. And that explains some of the recent decisions that the party is making, whether it is about cracking down on online gaming. They want youngsters to go out and date. They don't want them to be wasting time on gaming. It's a fact. Demographers, there are two sets of demographic data that is coming out of China, one that they want to tell the world and one that is actually correct. And that shows that birth rates have started declining very rapidly. And there is a 200 million is the gap that exists between the population that is being reported and that actually may be true. And that indicates that the fall is going to be fairly sharp and could happen before 2035, that some of them are suggesting. So yes, there is a huge chance that it may get poor or it may not get rich before it starts getting old. So yes, demography is going to play out as far as China's calculations are concerned. And that's going to play out on the comprehensive national park also that Professor Kondapalli pointed out earlier. Yes.
Create internal pressure within the CDC, that if nobody is going to get a chance to hide, there will be some.
You want to take that up, Mishra?
No, if you want, then
no, but please go ahead.
Field, but...
Okay. No, I think as far as Xi Jinping is concerned, he is very acutely aware that there is some sort of a possibility of even a coup that may happen right now, because the rumblings are now becoming louder. And it is being felt in all domains, whether it is on the political aspect, whether it is on the security aspect, or even on the economic aspects. They are feeling it. And also the second aspect that many people fail to appreciate is that every time when one talks about economic crackdowns in China, it impacts half of the Chinese Communist Party due to the back channel ownership that they all have. And when it starts becoming crackdown on companies, it becomes crackdown on your enemies and your potential arch rivals. So to that extent, the possibility of a coup is now beginning to really trouble Jinping. Whether he's going to survive till the age of 82, which is till when he's going to be the president for life, well, I don't think anybody can answer that.
And one very stark difference that we see between Xi Jinping and Chairman Mao is that Chairman Mao had the legacy of the communist movement. He was the one, who led it for decades. and he was the one who brought the Communist Party to power. And the post-Second World War situation all over the world was very different from what it is now. So he was able to carry it because the attention of America and the Western world was focused on the Soviet Union, unlike now when it is going to be focused. So sooner or later, I think that something is going to sort of create problem for Xi Jinping. This is how I will think.
For the, is until very recently, the CMC, the Chinese Military Commission, was under Jiang Zemin. It was under him. Xi Jinping took over as the CMC head only recently. So for a large extent, his crackdown on corruption, at least what it looks like openly, the crackdown on corruption in the military, etc., that has happened fairly recently. And he sort of, by taking over the military commission from Jiang Zemin, which happened, like I said, after a long gap, would that make a difference with how the military perceives Xi later?
Okay, now that is something that I will have to wait and watch. I won't hazard a guess on that as to how the military views Xi Jinping right now, because that's something that is yet to sort of be ascertained as well. You're right that there have been changes in the military aspects, but how it's going to pan out, because now he's the supreme leader in all aspects. So it is difficult to ascertain whether there can even be a backlash or not, that will be tolerated or not. Yes.
Yes. There were two questions from this.
I'm going to respond to that you mentioned about tariffs part. The book also says that. So it says that even now, the average tariff differential that exists between USA, EU and China is 3.5% for US, 5.3% for EU, and 9.5% for China. So even on an average basis, Chinese tariffs are 3 times more than what Americans charge. This is the latest. This is as per WTO data, and this is in violation because you're supposed to bring down your tariffs at par and not grant or demand exemptions. That's the point. That's the larger point that I was making. The second, you mentioned about dispute resolution. You said that why people are not taking China to court within WTO. That also it says that there are more complaints that are being filed against US. There are 18 trade disputes that are going on, and everybody is willing to file a case against America, but nobody is willing to file a case against China. Yeah, so the reason for that is the economic warfare that it uses, right? It stops your exports overnight. It did so with Norway, it did so with Mongolia, it did so with South Korea after it imposed the THAAD, it deployed THAAD. So that's why. Even the WTO is ineffective. That's what it says.
In that case, when you impose the export embargo, that becomes a dispute.
Right. So it's not being taken up, is what I'm saying, because countries are afraid of China, even in the WTO. That's what I'm saying.
All right. We have one last question.
Yes.
My question is that in the traditional sense, the strength of a nation was basically determined by 3 major factors, which were diplomacy, your military strength, and your economic strength.
Mm-hmm.
My point is that in the next 2 decades, how do we see a superpower emerging on the basis of distrust and a kind of a non-inclusive process? My point is it possible for China to become emerging and then going forward a superpower that will remain in power on the basis of distrust and a non-inclusive process, and just on the strength of its economic might and so on?
Okay.
China is a superpower. It is now well established. It is a superpower. It, as I said at the beginning, 120 countries trade with it, either as its largest or its second largest trading partner. It has its finger in every pie. Chinese officials are on record saying that we want to now look at outer space weaponization. We are very clear that even optical fiber network, which connects their digital Silk Route, should be open to be weaponizing. So they're clear that they're going to do even espionage and surveillance underwater. So they're very clear that all these are going to be the newer age aspects in which we are going to dominate. It is a superpower, but it is for want of a better word, it is a rogue superpower, for the simple reason that it is looking to turn the world upside down for everything that we hold dear. One may dispute, as Ambassador Stobdan said, that whether human rights are something that are our concept or not. But the fact is that China has made changes in UNHRC resolutions by not allowing for any review to take place. So that's why I said it's a rogue superpower. Can it sustain this for 20 years and 30 years is what the question is. And how can it be stopped is really the point, which is why what Sanjay Pulipaka said at the beginning when he said there's no question mark at the subtitle, because I believe that there cannot be. If there is a question mark, it means that there is a possibility of the world not countering China, and I think that's a possibility the world cannot afford.
Please come up and use the mic.
Yes.
Huh?
Come.
No, please come here, use the mic and please be
online.
brief, because we have run absolutely out of time now.
I just wanted to understand that since a large part of the book would have been written during the time, when I don't know whether Corona was there in that sense, such a big force or not. How do you factor the changes post-Corona? And the world actually seemed to have revolted against China to some extent, and everybody has been working on a China plus one strategy. So your question mark, which you didn't put, maybe in some way valid now, that everybody is looking to counter China. Everybody understands that they cannot live without China, but now is the time. If they can join forces, this is the best time. Do you think that things have changed post Corona, and whatever we saw of China?
Things have changed quite dramatically, Pankaj. And as far as the corona pandemic is concerned, the book talks about it. It says that's the inflection point, because till then the world thought that China was this benign superpower. It was the biggest supporter of globalization. It talked about trade. It talked about no barriers as far as trade is concerned. So what's the problem? Everybody is benefiting. It's good for everybody. But it's the coronavirus pandemic that became an inflection point for everybody to realize that was the facade. That was the mask that was finally taken away. And it was the pandemic that showed that what happened to Australia, what happened to Taiwan, what happened to Japan could happen to other countries as well, whether it is in terms of economic coercion, whether it is in terms of military might being displayed, or whether it is in terms of the possibility of the repercussions leading to something significant and bigger. I think that is something that the world understood post the pandemic. And the book it predates the Afghanistan developments, but it most certainly comes after the pandemic and talks about the ways in which China needs to be countered, from new age to even the traditional aspects of military domain that book talks about. But it says don't be fascinated and be only obsessed with the submarines that need to be deployed in South China Sea. That's not the answer. That's not the way to counter China. Look beyond those very myopic prism through which we view the Chinese threat. It's not about just the South China Sea.
Lastly, as I had said, after your presentation, that I have some questions arising out of presentation. As I frankly confessed, I have not read the book, but since I have interacted with you and I've heard through other discussion and this one, I have these questions. One, you say that you have argued in the book that the world seemed to be sleeping when China was rising. But is this really so? I think the world wasn't sleeping at all. It's just that it was a part of conscious strategy of the West from the 1970s onwards. Of course, you can identify two broad phases in it. One, from 1972 up to the disintegration of the USSR, and then from that time till about a few years ago, when the pivot to Asia started. So it was a part of a conscious strategy of America and its allies, because they realized that obviously, one, for defeating the Soviet Union, they needed the Chinese support, and for that, of course, Chinese economy needed to develop. And after that, they continued, because obviously then they sort of gained so much from the development and growth of China. Like you have given the data, so many thousands of Chinese American companies are there, and they have been supplying manufactured goods at a very, very cheap rate to Americans. Probably what happened is that, I'm just guessing, that of course it was a conscious strategy, but they had probably not calculated that China would rise so much and so fast. So it was a strategy, but a strategy which went awry in some sense. This is what I will think. Okay. Second, when you say that America cannot handle China alone, the question arises: did America handle even Soviet Union alone? It did not. You see, it's a very paradoxical thing about American foreign policy. In the 20th century, America has never taken on any big power all alone. In fact, America had to be sort of cajoled and persuaded into joining or leading an alliance by the other powers. This happened in the First World War, this happened in the Second World War, and this happened, of course, in the Cold War. America then had to take the lead. But the point is that it countered the the threat, as America and the Western world saw it, of the Soviet Union, not alone but as an alliance. So what prevents America from building another alliance? And I see the beginnings of that alliance already there. They are like Ambassador Stobdan said. I disagree with him that America has shed blood or will shed blood only for itself or for its brethren. No, America shed a lot of blood in Korea. There were no brothers involved there after all. So many people died there. So when their primacy is threatened and when they think that there is a real fundamental threat, obviously, their history shows that they have been ready to shed their blood. So here, I think that, the point that you are making, that America cannot take on China alone.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, in the past also, it has not acted alone, really.
Okay. Okay, so I take these two questions. Or why don't you go ahead, sir? Why don't you go?
No, only this.
Yes, okay.
These are the only things I
Okay.
wanted to
No,
say.
you're right. It's not like China is America's creation. You're right that it's not that China was created without America's active support, participation, and continued backing. Of course, it did. And you're right, Dr. Mishra, that it grew faster than what America assumed it would grow to. You're right about that. And but the reason why it said that while the world slept is because they couldn't fathom the extent to which China managed to create its influence and clout and managed to use it as a leverage. Whether it is infrastructure spending or whether it's military bases or whether it's economic power, all that it managed to utilize. And as far as whether it's enough to counter China, well, the only measure we have is history to go by, which is that, USSR was smaller than China, even at its peak. Whether you talk about in terms of its economic strength, whether you talk about it in terms of its reach. So that's the only benchmark we have. And also the difference that existed between America and USSR. That's the only benchmark.
I agree. Yes. Now, let me put a counter to what you are saying. In fact, unlike the Chinese state, the Russians have a much longer history of empire building, much longer.
Yes.
They were great empire builders in the last 300 to 400 years. Just look at the irony of it. There was a time when the Central Asians had occupied the kingdom of Muscovy.
Yeah.
And look at how from the 16th century onward, the Russians under the Tsars, they occupied all those countries from where these conquerors had came, one by one,
Yes.
by one,
Yes.
100 mile by another 100 mile. And till they had occupied the whole of Central Asia. Look at their great expansion over thousands of miles to Siberia,
Yes.
even to Alaska.
Yeah.
The fact is that compared to the Chinese, the Russians have had much bigger and
Expansive.
imperial tradition, and their state system was also strong, and they have faced many more wars also compared to China in the last 300 years.
Yes.
So China, when you say that Soviet Union was not a formidable enemy to America, I think
No, I didn't say that. No.
Okay,
but it's good to have this intellectual discussion, and I'm happy to be proven wrong as well.
The point I'm trying to make is just because Soviet Union had a smaller economy, we should not underestimate the power that the Soviet Union had in terms of its geographical size, in terms of its ideological motivation, in terms of its alliances, spread over East Europe, and of course its military technology. Because at the end of the day, all this is fine that economic power is important, no doubt. But at the end of the day, war is fought also with the military
All other
technology.
aspects, absolutely.
All other aspects are important.
And I'll be happy to be proven wrong, because that will mean that America is powerful enough to take on China. And that's an outcome that will only be appreciated by everybody. The only reason why the premise of this is the fact that America was stronger. That's the reason. That's the premise. That because during the peak of the Cold War, America was stronger than what it is right now. It was enough to take on USSR. That's the premise. And I would be only happy to be proven wrong, because that just means that China can be countered.
And one last point, since you are an economist, you see, I remember very well the times when Chinese economy was only 20% of what it is now. It's now 13 or 14 trillion dollars.
Yes.
Now, and Chinese economy was about 2.5 times or 3 times the size of Indian economy. I'm talking about exchange rate, not PPP. And then what happened? This is around 2003-4 when Goldman Sachs report had come. And then what happened was that the Indian currency, which was at around 40 at that time, it started depreciating against the dollar. Now it is at 75, and the Chinese currency is started rising. So much of the gap that we see between the GDP of India, which is 2.5 or 3 trillion today, and the Chinese GDP, which is 13 or 14 trillion today, it has happened because of this, because India has lost in terms of exchange rate and China has gained. Now this is a perfectly reversible thing also. You see.
Okay.
Just a thought to you.
Okay. I would, okay, maybe we'll need to study and come back for another discussion of this as to whether it's reversible or not.
My mind, Chinese gain because India built.
All right. Thank you very much. I think we have had a very good presentation and a very good panel discussion. And I thank Gaurie Dwivedi, and I thank Ambassador Stobdan, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, Dr. Sanjay Pulipaka for accepting our invitation to be present for this book discussion. And I thank all members of the audience for their very, very enthusiastic participation. We are, of course, going to have many more discussions of this type in the near future. We'll keep all of you informed about our other discussions and talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.